purpose is to provide council direction to staff as we start our 2022 budget process. So this is the first meeting on our 22 budget, and the majority of today is going to be spent on staff laying out the context for the budget process, and it's going to end with council providing some really good direction to our staff moving this forward. So thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to do a roll call, make sure we're all here and our mics are working. Councillor Foster.
Present. Sound check, please.
Councillor Van Leeuwen.
I'm here.
Councillor McElwain.
Present.
Councillor Kittrus.
Present.
Councillor Dunsmore.
Present.
Councillor McCrae.
Here.
Okay, good. We're all here. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest with anything on the agenda under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act today? Okay, I have a recommendation that the Council of the Township of Centre Wellington confirm the agenda for the Committee of the Whole pre-budget meeting held June 21st, 2021. Can I have a mover for that, please? Councillor McElwain, seconded by Councillor Dunsmore. Any opposed? And that is carried. No delegations. We'll move right to consideration of reports. And I will turn things over to our Managing Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer, Dan Wilson. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I'm just trying to set up my presentation here. Welcome everybody to our first 2022 budget meeting. As Mayor Linton mentioned, this is the first pre-budget meeting, and we plan to have more pre-budget meetings later after we get through some preliminary calculations and discussions at a staff level, but we'll go through the actual schedule itself as part of this meeting. I will share my screen hopefully here. And I'll go through a presentation of the various recommendations that staff would like direction on today from council. So the purpose of today really is to give staff some much needed direction to start the operating budget for 2022. The capital discussions are already underway at a staff level. We've had a few managing director, senior team meeting discussions from a capital perspective, and we plan on getting into more of the operating discussion later this summer, but to do that, there's a number of items we seek direction on. So we have 6 resolutions today for council to assist with. They're outlined on this slide. We have some information on OMPF funding and OSIF funding as well, but there's no resolutions attached to those 2 items. They're just provided for information for council. But the other 6 items do have a proposed resolution for council. So starting with the inflation discussion, so as we discuss every year, there's an operating component and a capital component to the township's operating budget. We have typical operating costs that are operating in nature that tend to follow the consumer price index in terms of price increases from year to year. We have capital related items, and what I'm thinking about there is pretty much our transfers to reserves that are used to fund capital projects every year. And we use the non-residential building construction price index for those related costs. And we do have costs that aren't really impacted by inflation, such as our debt payments every year. And I do like to point out that not all of our operating related costs increase in relation to CPI. Some increase higher, some are lower than CPI. A good example is insurance. Our insurance increases annually typically are much higher than CPI for that given year. Just some background information on inflation. This is the consumer price index from 2011 to 2021. So this is the operating related inflation index. You'll see for 2021, we're showing 3.3%. It's quite an increase from a year ago where we were at 0.7%. And just new information for council, I looked this morning and the May results for CPI are out, and they've gone from where we were in April at 3.3% up to 3.7%. So CPI continues to rise at this point. It may eventually come back down. We're not sure how long that's going to take. I think indications are that CPI over the long term trends close to 2%. But obviously right now we're in a period of high growth and CPI is a reflection of that right now. In terms of the non-residential building construction price index, this is for capital related costs. Showing 2011 to 2021. You'll see that we are up somewhat from a year ago. Year ago, we were at 2.5% increase year over year. And as of January's index, we're at 3.1% year over year increase. I checked again this morning to see if there's any updates on this index. This index is actually updated quarterly instead of monthly. So that's why we're only looking at January results. Nothing has come out yet, but we do believe that this index will continue to rise with construction material shortages that are experienced right now and just general increase in construction costs. We feel that this non-residential building construction price index will just continue to rise over time, but we will monitor this and report any differences back to council. So when you combine all of that into what we're considering a weighted index from a budget perspective, where we apply the CPI to operating related costs, the capital or the NRB CPI to the capital related costs, and then no index to the debt related costs. And this is using the April rates, so the 3.3% for operating. You get a blended rate of 3.2%. So that is suggesting from a year ago, costs are now 3.2% blended higher than they were a year ago. And I put the 2021 budget meetings there in red. You'll see that a year ago, we were discussing a 1.4% blended rate. And when we got to budget deliberations, actually at the end of last year, it was down to 1.1 or 1.07%. So it's quite an increase in costs from a year ago. And down on the left-hand side, I put the impact of the new May 2021 rates that I received this morning, where CPI was at 3.7%. That brings the blended rate up to 3.5%. So again, that's indicating that we're looking at about a 3.5% jump in costs going from the 2021 budget to the 2022 operating budget. And just to show you what's happened to CPI over the last number of months, this is showing month by month, starting when COVID-19 really started hitting everybody in February of 2020. You can see the significant drop in CPI shown in the blue line from February of 2020, really, and it stayed fairly low to about February of 2021. And then from February in 2021 onward, it's just shooting straight up, significant increases in CPI. So that's where in May we're seeing a CPI of 3.7% year over year increase. Just for council's consideration, we do have some additional information with respect to CPI. So the February 2020 to April 2021 average CPI year over year increase is 2.2%. The 3-month average, so that's February, March, and April of 2021, is 2.2% average, and the 6-month average is 1.6%. If you're interested in average rates rather than what's happening year over year based on the monthly rates that seem to be spiking quite significantly right now. So if you look at all of those results on one page from a consolidated or weighted index perspective, the top left-hand side is based on CPI to April, gives you a blended rate of 3.2%. Bottom left is looking at the new May rates of CPI of 3.7%. That gives us a blended rate of 3.5%. Top right is using the 3-month average CPI of 2.2%. That gives us a blended rate of 2.4%. And the bottom right is using the 6-month average CPI of 1.6%. And that gives us a blended budget increase of 2%. So what we're looking for is direction from council how staff can establish the preliminary operating budget for 2022. So we're providing this statistical information for council's consideration, whether we go with a budget increase not to exceed 3.5%, 3.2%, 2.4%, 2%, or another number indicated by council. So that would be the first area that we're looking for consideration on. The second is assessment growth. So this is taxation-based assessment growth. As council is aware, with growth in the township, we take on a number of new assets, roads, sidewalks, water, wastewater mains, water supply and wastewater treatment related, stormwater related, parks, sports fields, playgrounds, programming increases, the impact on fire services increases, administration and general government increases as a result of growth. And then we have the results of provincial downloading and taking on new legislative changes from a provincial perspective as well. So within the strategic plan that was adopted by council, there's a strategic direction that growth is to pay for growth. So what that means is, from an operating budget perspective, we want to use this assessment growth for tax-related impacts to the operating budget due to growth. We have water and wastewater related budgets as well. We would use increase in revenue from new customers coming onto the water and wastewater system to address costs that are impacted due to growth on the water and wastewater budget. So we can use assessment growth and new water and wastewater customers and the revenue associated with that to help us with growth paying for growth from an operating perspective. And from a capital perspective, we have development charges, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. We have developer contributions, where developers are responsible for particular costs associated with growth. So with those two aspects, both the operating and the capital side, we're trying to follow that strategic direction approved by council of growth paying for growth. So what we want to have direction on as part of this report is to, first of all, set a preliminary estimate for taxation assessment growth for 2022. That will be updated as we get new information from MPAC later this year. And then use that assumption based on the strategic direction of growth paying for growth, so that we can use assessment growth to pay for impacts to the 2022 operating budget as a result of growth. So you'll see at the bottom of the page, we have some historical information when it comes to assessment growth. The 10-year average is about 2.4%. And the last 3 years were 3.65%, 2.23%, and 2.33%. So what we're suggesting at this point is, at least for now, let's start with a 2% estimate when it comes to assessment growth for 2022. The average for the 10 years did have a couple of large assessment years in there that drove the average up. And we can certainly add to this as we get new information from MPAC. But we want to use the average of 2% for 2022, and that we want that to pay for costs in the operating budget considered growth in nature. And we will update that at a later date. Fees and charges is section 3. So this is a significant portion to the budget every year, and we bring forward the new fees and charges bylaw to council in association with the budget. So a good way to look at fees and charges, if you increase fees and charges at the same rate as the budget increase, you're pretty much keeping the taxation subsidization to fees and charges consistent from the previous year to the current year. If you decide to increase fees and charges as a rate lower than the budget increase, you're basically increasing that tax subsidization. So the cost of providing those services that are funded by fees and charges will occur unless we look at changes to levels of service. It's just a matter of whether you want fees and charges to pay for those services or if you want taxation to subsidize those services. So what we're looking at is, these are the fee categories that we look at on an annual basis. In green, you will see what we did last year. Council approved a 0% increase to Parks and Recreation fees and charges. And the water wastewater rates were increased based on the rates approved in our approved rate study. But the rest of the fees and charges more or less increased at a rate similar to the budget increase. So what we're looking for is direction from council how to increase the fees and charges for 2022. So we have the same percentages shown in section 1, which is the budget increase, the tax rate increase. And the reason for that is because we like to make that connection between the two, because if you're increasing one at a rate different than the other, you're really increasing or decreasing that tax subsidization for fees and charges, and increasing the tax subsidization puts additional pressure on the operating budget. Okay, section 4 is OMPF funding. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have a recommendation for council in this section. We just want to provide this information for council's information. So OMPF stands for the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund. We receive this annually from the province, and it has decreased significantly since 2009. In recent history, we've been seeing 15 to 20% decreases annually. We have not heard any indication as to what the rates will be for 2022, but we are estimating at this point that it'll be an additional 15% decrease. So this is what's happened since 2009, where we had OMPF funding of roughly $1.5 million. This year in 2021, we're receiving just over $230,000. So you can see that's a fairly significant drop from 2009. And what we're suggesting for the 2022 budget is to take the 2021 allocation and reduce it by 15%. So we're estimating at this point that we're going to receive roughly $196,000 in OMPF funding. So that's roughly $1.35 million decrease from what we received in 2009. So that's put added pressure on our operating budget annually since 2009. Another section that has no council direction needed is the OSIF funding that we receive annually from the province. This is a major funding source for our bridge and culvert plan that we put in place with council, the 10-year plan. That will come forward at a future budget meeting. This is under review by the province right now, but we haven't seen significant change in the funding in the last 3 years. You'll see from this graph, in 2019, we received just over 1.2 million, and in the last 2 years, it's gone up to about 1.27 million. So about a $70,000 increase from 2019 to what we received over the last 2 years. So we're suggesting at this point that we're just going to assume it'll remain the same again for 2022 at the $1.27 million. And we'll use that until we get further information from the province, which hopefully comes before we get too far into our capital budget process. Section 6 is development charges. This is a significant source of funding for the township in the capital budget. It was 11% of our funding needs in 2021, 6% in 2020, and it does fluctuate based on the demands of growth within the township from year to year. In the past, we've been assuming a funding source of about $1.5 million annually in the 10-year forecast to be funded from development charges. And this very much dictates how much we can take on from a growth-related perspective within our capital budget every year. So when we don't have the cash flow needed for something that's growth related and it's something that must continue or is recommended to move forward in the near future, we do look at borrowing through debt and then paying for those principal and interest payments through growth related debt. So in recent history, we've done that for some of the significant water capital projects coming out of the water supply master plan. So that's something that we've done in recent past. What we are recommending for 2022 is to increase the $1.5 million annual amount from development charges to capital to $1.7 million. We're seeing a significant increase in proceeds annually for development charges. We have a really strong balance in our DC reserve fund right now. And we just finished a DC background study that council approved earlier this year that saw a slight increase in rates as a result of the planned growth to 2041. So we are suggesting we can prepare the 10-year forecast this year using $1.7 million in DCs annually rather than 1.5 million. So that is the recommendation we are looking for from council today. Section 7 is capital funding for 2022. So this is capital funding excluding what we have for the bridges and culverts, which is the OCIF funding and the dedicated capital levy. So other than bridges and culverts, we have other tax supported funding of vehicle and equipment replacement reserves, general capital reserve, the federal gas tax reserve fund, and the OLG reserve. So that's what makes up our tax supported capital funding in any given year, more or less. From a vehicle and equipment replacement reserve schedule, and we prepared the schedules last year. As you know, we prepared these schedules for a 10-year forecast period, and it indicated from 2021 to 2022 that we would need approximately $79,000 in addition to what's in the reserve, and what's in addition to what the contribution is built into the budget in order to fund the 2022 year. So what we're suggesting is that we move forward with that number for now. We're about to start discussions with departments on vehicle and equipment needs for 2022, and we have some preliminary indications that some of the prices for vehicles are increasing as a result of CPI and inflation right now, but we'll have more information from council on that in a future meeting. The second piece of capital funding is the general capital reserve. We have an existing balance of approximately 2.5 million in that reserve, but we have a loan out of the reserve that has an existing balance of about $260,000, and that was something that happened prior to this term of council, where amounts were borrowed from the general capital reserve to fund a bridge, and it was outlined through the bridge plan a number of years ago, and I believe it's being paid back over 5 years, and we're approaching the end of that payback period. Also, we have a minimum balance we keep in the general capital reserve as per our reserve fund policy of 1.1 million, and that's acting as a stabilization for any increases in capital costs in the 2022 year. So when you take those two amounts into account, we have a net balance of 1.15 million in the reserve that we can use for the 2022 budget. But we also have an 875,000 contribution to that reserve that's already built in through the 2021 budget. And as in the last couple of years, we're recommending to council that at a minimum we increase that 875,000 by an additional 25,000 to 900,000. So at least we have a small increase in contributions to these tax-supported funding that we have for the capital budget. So if we add 900,000 to that net balance, we have approximately $2,051,000 for general capital that can go into the 2022 capital budget. Next is gas tax funding. We're anticipating a 2022 allocation of gas tax funds of just over $894,000. That's in our agreement through AMO. As you'll recall, a couple of months ago, we had a report to council that outlined that we received 859,000 additional gas tax funding for 2021, and it was recommended and approved by council that we allocate that to the 2022 budget. So we have that to add to this as well. And we have roughly 183,000 in unused gas tax and interest earned on gas tax that we can add to this as well. So in total, we have just over 1.9 million in gas tax funds that we can allocate to the 2022 budget for this year. And the last one is OLG funds. So for now, we're using the current council approved OLG policy, but we'll bring that forward for discussion at a future meeting, where 88% up to a maximum of 2.2 million goes to township capital, 5% goes to arts, culture, and heritage, and the remaining balance goes to economic development. So we will use that for now as a preliminary number until we have a chance to discuss this policy with council. In terms of estimated amounts received for the 2022 budget, the way our policy works is the amounts received in 2021 go towards the 2022 budget. So we're not spending the money before we actually receive it. So we are estimating roughly $550,000 to be received this year from OLG funds. 40,000 has already been received based on Q1 results for 2021. And we're anticipating zero proceeds for Q2. We made some preliminary estimates for Q3 and Q4 based on 2019 contributions, which was the last normal year of OLG contributions received. So that gives us our approximate proceeds of $550,000. So you see that's well below 2018 and 2019, where we received $2.3 and $2.7 million respectively when it comes to OLG proceeds. And it's even below what we received last year of approximately $820,000. We can update this as the year progresses, as the facility, the OLG facility, is able to open. But for now, we'd like to plan on receiving approximately $550,000. Taking that $550,000 and using the OLG allocation policy that was currently approved by council, you'll see the first column shows that $484,000 would go to township capital, roughly $27,000 to arts, culture, and heritage, and $38,000 to economic development. And then when you add that to unused amounts in those reserves, we have roughly $560,000 to go towards township capital, $32,000 for arts, culture, and heritage, and $357,000 for economic development. Bringing together the general capital reserve, the gas tax money, and the OLG funds, we have approximately $4.55 million in funding to go to 2022 capital this year. That is up significantly from what we had last year of $3.3 million, but we're still below the funding we had in 2020, which is a starting point where we have to start looking at somehow increasing our capital funding annually from year to year. So it's definitely a positive result in comparison to 2021, but we're still below the funding levels we had 2 years ago in 2020. So our recommendation here from council is to allocate the $4.55 million in combined funding towards the tax-supported capital budget for 2022. Apply the $79,000 increase to the equipment and vehicle replacement reserves as discussed. And then we will bring forward any other reserve top-ups that are required as part of the 2022 budget as well. And that usually affects our WSIB reserve, our insurance claim reserve, our contingency reserve, and our legal matters reserve, as they are recommended to be at target levels throughout the year. And just on that note, in July, we're proposing to bring forward to council a discussion on our reserve fund policy, so you can take a look at some of those minimum target balances and how these reserves are actually funded annually. The last section is the budget timeline for 2022. So this budget timeline is set with the goal of having the 2022 budget approved before the end of 2021. So we want to have the budget approved by the December 2021 council meeting. We want to set the timeline so we can get appropriate direction from council and obviously have sufficient public input as part of the process as well. So those are our key objectives in setting this timeline. So we're here today on June 21st to discuss the first pre-budget meeting, getting direction from council and approving the timeline itself. The next meeting is proposed to be September 7th, 1 o'clock, and that's where we have a preliminary look at the 2022 capital budget. October 4th is where we have a more detailed look at budget impacts and discussions, and we typically look at more of the capital forecast in relation to maybe 2022, 23, and 24 as an example. And at that meeting, we take budget delegations. So if there's members of the public that would like to speak to the budget, that would be their first opportunity to participate as part of a budget meeting on October 4th. We are recommending October 8th to October 29th, a public input and information session through Connect CW. Similar to last year, where we would have a presentation that members of the public could watch on Connect CW and provide much needed information and input on the budget process through that medium. On November 22nd, we would make the budget book available to council and the public for review. The first budget deliberation meeting is proposed for November 30th. Second meeting on December 2nd. It's a unique calendar year where that first meeting in December, where we typically try to set budget deliberations, actually straddles November and December. So we actually get the first pre-budget or first budget deliberation meeting in November. Budget delegations would be available on November 30th. So again, if members of the public wish to come and speak to council on the budget, there's another opportunity on November 30th. We've set aside December 7th as an additional third day for budget deliberations if needed. And the December 20th council meeting is where we propose that the 2022 budget is passed by council. Passing it in December of 2021 allows us to get a good start on tenders and proposals and purchases for the 2022 year. And we typically get very favorable prices if we can get those tenders and proposals out early in January of 2022. So that concludes the presentation. And I think I will stop sharing from here, and we're happy to take any questions from council. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. Dan, how did you picture doing this? Do you want us to go resolution by resolution? We'll just start on section 1, get some direction from council, then move on to the next one. Is that how you're picturing it?
I think that would be a great way to do it, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's do that then, council. We'll go back to the first resolution. Make sure you're back at your package, the first resolution. And that is the overall, looking at an overall tax rate. And we'll start from there. As you can see, staff have identified 3 different options, but obviously it's council's prerogative to choose something else. But they've put 3 different scenarios in front of us here. So let's just have the discussion first, and if you have any questions, now would be the time around this first round here to ask any questions of our staff as well. We'll start with Councillor McCrae.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I guess my concern is the fact that we are receiving less OLG and OMPF funding. My concern is that the gap between trying to maintain the appropriate level of maintenance and replacement of our infrastructure, as well as other operating costs, becomes tougher to close. So I guess I have to say I'm in favor of the 3.2% increase in order to keep us from having a broadening gap and being able to address expenses that we have to deal with.
Thanks, Councillor McCrae. Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions regarding inflation. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of friends who are in the retail industry, and 3.1%, Dan, seems to them that is really, really low. That they're hearing from suppliers and supply chain people that this inflation rate is going to be quite a bit higher. One of the ways that we could probably gauge what's happening municipally, do we have any data or any idea how the RFPs that we have in the pipeline right now, are they coming in greatly inflated? Are they meeting the targets that we set, or are we starting already to start paying more money for those projects?
Yeah, good question, Councillor Dunsmore. Dan, do you want to take that?
Yes, through you, Mayor Linton. I agree. I think the numbers we're presenting to council today could be low based on what we could see in the next number of months. Unfortunately, when StatsCan releases CPI and NRB CPI, there's always a lag in terms of what the market is actually doing. So as I indicated earlier, we do see these indexes will continue to rise in 2021, where we could be seeing much higher impacts. So we will keep council up to date with these as we move forward in future pre-budget meetings. In terms of tenders and proposals, we did have in the very near past, we did have one tender that we decided to cancel at a staff level because the cost came in significantly higher than what we thought it was going to be. It was a bridge rehabilitation project. I'm not sure if Colin wants to comment on this as well, but I think we are generally seeing costs coming in a little higher or much higher than what we were anticipating when we set the budget in 2021.
Yeah, I can just add to that, Dan. Yeah, it was very little interest. I think that probably contributed as well. We only received one bid on that request for tender, and yeah, I think it's an indication, and we've heard this from kind of the associations, from the contractors as well, that material prices are increasing, whether it's steel, concrete. You know, we've all heard about the lumber prices increasing. You know, there's significant increases for materials in the construction industry right now. So that's definitely driving up construction pricing quite significantly right now.
Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about asset management, Dan, on this. You know, that's what really kind of drives the budget. So when we're seeing huge cost increase like that, from a legislative standpoint with asset management, how much wiggle room do we have as a municipality to push projects out until the inflation starts to decrease? Is that something we have the opportunity to do, or do we have the opportunity to borrow from reserves as opposed to increasing the tax rate?
Through Mayor Linton, yeah, with the asset management legislation that was passed by the province a couple of years ago, municipalities are held more accountable to meeting the expectations of their asset management plan and funding their asset needs, life cycle asset needs over the long term. So it's something that we're legislatively required to do now going forward is almost like a report card in terms of how your budget compares to asset management regulation requirements going forward. So that becomes more of an issue going forward as we meet the requirements of the legislation in 2022 and 2024. When it comes to delaying capital projects, I always say delaying capital projects just makes them more expensive. You're delaying projects. Every year you delay a capital project, you're adding capital inflation to that project to make it that much more expensive. But it is a strategy you can use. We have projects that are delayed because of financial constraints, and they are being delayed, and they are costing more when we get to them. So that's a reality that I think every municipality is facing right now. Borrowing from reserves is an option. We don't have that many reserves and balances that we could borrow from. We had a report to council not too long ago where we recommended to borrow from the water reserve for some water projects, which assisted in reducing our debt impacts going forward. But I think our ability to do that is fairly limited given the capital needs that we have shown in our asset management plan.
Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, this will be it, and I'll let somebody else speak. So Dan, we've identified that the vehicle reserve is down 79,000. Are there shortfalls in any of the other asset reserves that we have that we are going to have to start looking at addressing?
Yes, through Mayor Linton, that's a great question. Every year when we bring forward the budget in December, we always show a comparison of where we are in relation to the asset investment identified in our asset management plan. And when we brought forward the 2021 budget in January, we indicated that we were falling significantly behind in our investment in capital assets in comparison to what the asset management plan indicated. We were able to keep up to date and close to the recommendation to 2020, And the main reason for that was we were seeing increases in gas tax funding. We were seeing increases in OSIF funding. We had the dedicated capital levy going up every year. And that contributed to us keeping on pace with our asset management recommendations. But starting in 2021, we didn't have the DCL increase. The OSIF and the gas tax money has stabilized. We're not seeing the increases in capital investment that we had in the past. So we have fallen behind. And that's going to be a detailed discussion point when we get into future budget meetings, as well as when we bring forward the new asset management plan to council later this year.
Councillor Kittrus?
Thank you, Mayor. I have a lot of questions. My first question is about, first of all, I'm going to just make a statement. In the inflational analysis that you did, for government, you can't just use 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. You need to go on an average of several years so that you can balance. And when it's low, you take the lower and then you have to balance all those things. Last year we had it lower because we weren't providing services. COVID happened. Lots of things were, people didn't have as much demand for their services, so things are lower. Oil was down, and all those things saved money for us. But now, from the marketplace, what Councillor Dunsmore is saying, that inflational is increasing, is actually true. But we can't increase it at the same rate that the possible demands will happen, because it will be closer to 6, 7. There's 5.5 in many areas in the US, and those are supply problems. And so we have to be reasonable and take averages. I think the last year we did do averages over year, so we had a kind of a balanced policy. If we keep just going every 3 months or whatever, I mean, by the end of the year, everyone knows supply chains are we can't increase taxes or rates 5 or 7%. Like, that would be, on top of the burden of the regular taxpayer having to live with 5 to 6% increases in their everyday life. We cannot burden them with that increase. So that's why I think that the year-on-year approach of seeing what the averages are and see how we go is probably the best approach for the inflational perspective, rather than saying it'll be 3 months. Last year was an unusual year, catastrophic year for some people, and it was reasonable for us to have a much lower rate for them. Assessment growth, I don't understand why we're increasing the assessment growth if growth pays for growth. Because let's say you have 100 houses, you're collecting taxes on 100 new houses to service all the roads, all the administration, all that is built into that tax rate, and you're receiving that. So you have 100 new houses, average taxation by your budget thing is, I don't know, $3,200. Well, you're going to be collecting all that money, and so you don't need to increase based on assessment, because it's built into the tax of all the new subdivisions and new things. They're paying for all that. So I don't think that assessment should grow at all, because you're going to be receiving those taxes that have been applied to all the new roads and the areas and subdivisions that you have to do, and all the administration involved with that, and those things are built into that tax rate.
Sorry, a point of order, just for clarity's sake. We're dealing only with the first assumption right now.
Yes,
so we're only dealing
part of this.
Well, I know, but you're getting into the next part. So let's make sure that we stay scoped in. We're talking about inflation and tax rate increase right now.
Yeah, but the tax rate is going to be the fundamental increase. And I'm saying that the assessment one is adding to it. So, I mean, I don't see how that's wrong. And then the
Oh, sorry, point of clarification. I just want to make it clear to all councillors, like they all affect each other. So all of these 7 areas are all connected. That's why we're doing it in one day. But we're just trying to sequence it out so we have a little bit more of a targeted discussion. Obviously, they're all connected, but let's try. I know it's easy to go beyond, but let's try to stick to the overall rate that we're talking about. Councillor Kitchus?
I am doing that. I think that being censored is not correct. I think I should be able to speak about the
Point of
action.
order. Sorry, please don't. I'm chairing the meeting, and I'm asking us to stay in scope. We're laying it out this way for a reason. So just let's try to stay in scope. That's all. Councillor Kitcher? You're on mute, Councillor Kittress.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't understand also why we always give the information on the OMPF and the OCIF. They barely actually are government grants that balance each other out since, since 2019, 18. I mean, I think there's like not that very many dollars difference. We're not shortfalled. They're both grants, and they're like pointing out in red that we're out $1.3 million is inaccurate because they're both grants. And
sorry, point of order again. Again, let's stick to the order. We're talking right now about overall direction related to inflation. We have a whole section related to OMPF that we'll get to. You're back on mute, Councillor Kitcher.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't agree that we should be increasing it at 3.2% because it should be taken over a year by year basis so it averages out to a certain amount. Second of all, I think that choosing a target with the understanding that there may not be any more lockdowns, which I don't think we can guarantee that. And since the premier's emergency orders are till December, and he can extend them at any time, and he has done it several times, I don't think that we could firm up right now what the rates should be for next year, since that it could, many people say that it could go on to 2022. And so I feel that to go really, really high and make a decision right now has to be weighed and varied, that if there's a lockdown or any sort of thing, that our decision now is waived and it is not accurate, because we'll need to address that in the future. And so on the one part of the inflational part is that we need to go more but year by year. We can't just go on short little terms and then in 3 months say, oh, it's got to increase now because we're facing these. We should be trying to have it level and not add more pressure to the consumer that is living in the municipality. And the other part is, I think that if there is a lockdown, services will be declining, and therefore they're, again, like last year, they paid for services, but they didn't receive them. And so I think it's a little early if we don't know how the COVID out thing is going to work. So that's my thing. I think we should really reconsider this and be as low as possible and have the preliminary thing that if there's a lockdown, we revisit that percentage and go lower.
Councillor McElwain?
Thanks, Mayor. Dan, we have a reserve for the COVID-19 reserve, and I can't recall how much is left in that. Is the inflationary cost this year, could the COVID-19 reserve be applied to covering some of that inflation instead of hitting the taxpayer with all of it?
Dan?
Through Mayor Linton, yeah, that's a great question. Direction from the province so far has not indicated that we can use inflationary impacts as a COVID-19 related impact that's funded through provincial funding. That's something we can ask the province as we go through the 2021 reconciliation, but at this point, it has not been provided as direction.
Just as a follow-up to that one, we as a township chose to put extra funding into the COVID-19 reserve, in particular our what do you call it? The money that we collected over the budget last year. And so we put extra money into that reserve. Does the province dictate that money has to be spent on certain things as well, or just because we put it into the COVID reserve?
Through Mayor Linton, no. If township money goes into that reserve, then the township determines the use of those funds. We will be bringing forward proposed direction for the COVID-19 reserve as part of this budget, because we do foresee impacts due to COVID extending out at least another 2 to 3 years, especially when it comes to investment income, because it'll take a number of years for rates to rebound and generate the investment income that we were generating back in 2020.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, thanks. I would love to use what we can out of that reserve, or whatever reserve, to keep the rate down below 3%, because I think that there are too many people still hurting from COVID, and to raise taxes over 3% this year is just, it's penalizing them too much. So that's my overall objective, is bring that cost to that rate increase down to close to 2% as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McElwain. Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Thanks, Mayor, through you. Yeah, first off, I would agree somewhat with Councillor Kittredge and Councillor McElwain that the inflationary aspects due to COVID are most likely way higher than the 3.2%, especially in the building construction area, which we tend to play in more when it comes to infrastructure. And so I have a huge concern with the fact that COVID and the lockdowns has really messed with the supply chain and with inflationary numbers. But in that regard, we can't per se push it too high, because we still don't know what's going to happen in the coming year. And I do believe that we can average it out with some of those reserves, as Councillor McElwain had stated. So hopefully we can balance it and slowly grow without going to a 3 or 4% inflationary. So I personally, at this point, I would start with the 2.4. And as we continue to go through the year, I know that we've been flexible enough throughout the year to be able to kind of dodge and move as we see things change. So I would, if this is direction to staff, let's start with the 2.4%. And as we progress through the year, if something drastic changes and we really see inflation continuing to rise, then we can pivot as we see this before we hit to the December mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Van Leeuwen. Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Mayor. I have a number of points I want to make, and the very first point is on the macroeconomics of inflation. There's lots of discussion today that we need to increase taxes by 3.5% because of inflation, because of high COVID inflation. And yet all indicators are very clear that this has been caused by an increase in the money supply. It's been caused by COVID type problems on the supply side. And most economists believe that inflation is very transitory, is the word, which is a euphemism for temporary. And we're already seeing a reduction in inflation. Lumber futures, for example, Colin, they've already fallen 40% since their COVID high. So the price per 1,000 feet of board feet of lumber has already fallen 40% on the futures market. That's a very clear sign that inflation is temporary. All other indicators also show that inflation is going to be temporary. So I don't feel it's accurate nor reasonable to justify a large tax increase based on inflation. All macroeconomic theory is showing us that inflation is going to be temporary. It's a temporary problem. It's going to be transitory. Second point I want to make is there's been lots of talk about attainable housing. We know we have a problem with attainable housing in our community, and here we are proposing to make that problem even worse by galloping increases in taxation. We're going to, to raise taxes by 3.5% or more is not going to achieve any desirable outcome on the problem of attainable housing. The third point I want to make is we've had rapid growth of assessment. That means net new tax dollars coming from new houses coming on stream. We've had lots of new revenue from assessment. I also agree with Councillor McElwain. I believe that spoke about how difficult the economy is and people are suffering. We've had job loss. We have economic issues. People are concerned about the loss of CERB and getting things back to normal. This is not the year to make this problem worse with a large taxation increase. And finally, I believe we could get a much, much lower rate of increase. As I have said many times, I believe our senior management needs to do a much better job of management cost control. We need to do a better job controlling our operating costs so that we don't have such a large increase in taxation. Dan Wilson, you mentioned OMPF funding. Basically, since 2009, we've lost about $1 million from OMPF funding, and yet back in 2009, we levied about 7 million of taxation, and now we're up into the 15 million range. So we're the 8 million in new taxation since 2009 has more than offset the non-material loss of just $1 million of OMPF funding. So you can't use that, Dan, to justify a rapid increase in taxation, nor can you use it based on the loss of OLG funding. The loss of funding this year from the OLG is more than offset by a large increase in taxation generally, as well as a large increase from the bridge levy. We have had lots of revenue coming in. We've got to do a better job controlling our costs, and I believe we need to get to zero this year. This is the year for a 0% increase to help our citizens, to help our people who are struggling, and we can easily get there with better management cost control. So I call for a 0% increase.
All right, thanks, councillors. I just wanted to correct something, a little bit of a mischaracterization of what staff is doing. Staff isn't proposing high taxes. As you can clearly see in the documentation, they're providing us with options to consider based on the requirements, asset management requirements, and the rest is up to council, and all of us understand that. The second thing is providing numbers with OMPF funding. It sets the context. There's nothing, no direction provided by Dan in providing council with information about our OMPF reductions. So I want to make it clear that staff is just providing information. It's council's job today to establish direction. As far as my thoughts, really good discussion around the table. It's difficult for us. We have asset management challenges, real asset management challenges. We also have to balance that off with people's ability to pay, and that's what makes our job so difficult. Is we can't just think about one of those areas, because if we're out of balance, we're going to have a real hard time providing really good government here. So I'm personally feeling like we need to go somewhere between 2 and 3. I think that's where we should be as far as the balance goes. And I'd kind of like the idea of starting with a 2.4 and seeing what we can get and giving staff direction around that. That's my thoughts on it. I don't think we can go lower than that and not fall too far behind on an asset management front. But yet I don't think we can try to use this as a year with the difficulties that a lot of our families and our businesses have had. I don't think we can go higher than that because I think that's going to be too difficult with people trying to reemerge from a really difficult year. So that's kind of where my brain is going. Just to add my 2 cents here. So let's just go around the room. I just want to make sure that we're providing some clear direction to staff about it. If you can give where you think a number could be, then we can get a motion on the floor with this one, because it is important to provide staff with direction. They have to build a lot of their work on top of this assumption. So even though we don't have all the answers, even though we can't predict how things are going to go over the next few months, we need to provide some direction to staff so that they can do their work. And they have a pretty aggressive timeline to get this draft budget ready for us. So we really do need to provide them with some direction and take some educated assumptions here. So I'll start with Councillor McCray, and we'll just go around. And if you could provide your thoughts on direction, that'd be great. Councillor McCray?
I admit 3.2 is high in my part. I think 2 is too low, and I think 0 is ridiculously too low. So I'd be in favor of middle of the road, 2.4%.
Thanks, Councillor McCray. Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, I worry about how far behind we're falling with our asset management reserves. And I understand that growth pays for growth, but when we take on those new roads and those new sidewalks that they paid for, we're obligated to add that to our asset management list and put money aside to replace and repair those roads in 15, 20 years when it's ready. And we're falling behind slightly in that. I do not want a 3.2% increase because I think it's too high. So I would be happy to sit somewhere around 2.4, is somewhere above 2. So I'd be happy with anywhere above 2 and in around 2.4 or below. So,
Councillor Kittredge?
I think it should be as low as possible. Since we don't know what the future is going to have, I think adding burden to the taxpayer is at this time is not responsible, since we don't know how this whole COVID thing will happen. I have to agree with Councillor Foster that the inflational rate is transitory. They've been trying to pump it up for ages, and his description of inflation from a governmental side of it is totally accurate, and the COVID is added to that, and hopefully it is transitory. I personally, I'd like to have 2, but I'd like to have the provision to go lower. You know, if information comes out that way. So I think starting off high is I think you can always go up, but you should start with the lowest amount and build from there. And I'd like a recorded vote for this too.
Councillor McElwain?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I would still prefer 2 to 2.4. It will change as we get more information throughout the year on inflation and everything else, but I would rather see the building the budget based on a 2 versus based on 2.4, because it's hard to bring it back after it's gone after we start building on that infrastructure. So I would rather see a 2 to start with, and it can be increased if it's absolutely necessary.
Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Yeah, as I said, I could be in the 2.4 and I don't mind. I could also go down 2.4 and below would be my preference to around the 2. Thanks.
Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Mayor. Management cost control is essential here, and I see very little of it in this organization. I think we could do a far better job of controlling our operating costs, and if we did that, we can easily address our asset management plan by increasing transfers to reserves, and then we'd have more dollars available for asset management. Cost control is essential for any successful organization, and I think we could easily get to zero. There's a number of initiatives we could undertake. How about a hiring freeze for 1 year? How about a 1-year moratorium on vehicle purchases? And how about we stop hiring consultants when we have our own highly skilled staff available to do the work? I call for zero increase. This is the most difficult year in the last 100 with COVID-related problems, and our people are suffering.
Thanks very much, councillors. I've mentioned what I'd be supportive of. I like the vocabulary 2.4 or less, because I don't think we should be higher than that. So I'd be willing to go with that terminology if somebody is willing to put a motion on the floor. Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Yeah, I'd like to, I could put a motion on the floor of 2.4% inflationary, or sorry, 2.4 or below inflationary measure based on for the 2022 budget.
Councillor Van Leeuwen, can you clarify that we're talking about a tax rate increase of 2.4 or below? Because we're using the inflation as an indicator, but we really need to get a motion related to a tax rate increase. Is that what you're proposing?
I apologize. Yes, we're talking 2.4 and or below for the tax rate.
Seconder for that, please. Councillor Dunsmore. Any discussion about that? Anything new though? Councillor Kittredge?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to receive from the staff the average inflationary over a series of years so that we can assess this later if it's going to be 2.4 and less, and then we can judge from there to decide to perhaps go less anyway.
Okay, so now that there's a motion on the floor, the discussion now is for the debate around that motion, not for asking for additional information from staff. We did go around a couple times to get that, and I'm sure that that would be something that staff could provide to council, but it's not germane to the motion on the floor right now. Anything else as far as the motion right now? Councillor Foster, anything that new?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to speak against the motion. It's very clear that in the last several years, when you net out inflation, here we are, we're using inflation. The opening report used inflation as a justification for a tax rate increase. Yet if you look at macroeconomic trends over 5 years and 10, inflation, we're actually skating towards deflation. So you cannot use a temporary blip in inflation as a justification to increase taxes. So I speak against the motion of 2.4. That's not good enough. Inflation is clearly temporary. I call for zero, and I also call for a recorded vote on this matter. 2.4 is not good enough.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Foster. And a recorded vote has already been asked for, so there's no need to ask again. Anything else as far as comments? Questions from council? Okay, all in favor of the motion, 2.4 or less? Opposed? And I'll let our clerk go through the recorded vote.
Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Kittredge,
No.
Councillor McElwain,
Yes.
Councillor McRae,
Yes.
Councillor Dunsmore,
Yes.
Counselor Van Leeuwen,
Yes.
Counselor Foster,
No.
and Mayor Linton.
Yes.
It is in fact carried.
Okay, thanks, Council. And now we're going to go on to our second section, and that's related to assessment growth. So what we're being asked to is to the proposed resolution on the table right now, staff are required direction to assume assessment growth equal to 2% to be used to fund budget increases considered to be growth in nature, with assessment growth figures to be updated when actuals are provided in November when received. So obviously, if we're okay with the 2% assumption, that would change if the actuals change in November. Questions on, so right now we're just asked to approve an assumption that is going to be built in to the work that our staff do. Okay, is everybody clear on what we're being asked for here? Okay, so let's go around the room and make, Councillor Van Leeuwen, clarity?
Well, it's not clarity, but I need to step out for a quick break here. Can we take like a 5-minute break?
Sure, we can take a 5-minute break. Yeah, we'll come back here at 11:20.
Thank you.
All right, 11:20. Welcome back, everyone. Section 2, the proposed resolution about the assumption for assessment growth. And I'll start, Councillor McCray.
I think the 2% is a reasonable place to start. When they talk about the possibility that the province might be downloading more services to municipalities, this is currently a concern with conservation authorities in terms of some of their services may actually be taken away and given to municipalities. So I think this is a good starting point for us.
Councillor Dunsmore.
Yeah, I agree with Councillor McCray. 2% is a good place to start, and let's see what the actuals come in at.
Councillor Kitcheris.
I have a few questions. Thank you, Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
What is the average assessment rate that we have had over a period of time? And what is the projected assessment rate through the MPAC assessments?
Dan?
Thank you, Mayor Linton. Through you, the 10-year average assessment growth is at 2.4%. In terms of, I think your other question was referring to reassessments, which is different from assessment growth, but reassessments, the MPAC has decided to delay reassessment of properties. 2022 assessment will not be reassessed, and it'll be similar to 2021. So there's no reassessment impacts for 2022. But when it comes to assessment growth, like I said, 2.4% average for the last 10 years, but we're suggesting to move forward with 2% for now, just because there's some larger assessment growth increases in that 10-year average that sort of bring up the average. And we'll just wait until November when we get the actual assessment growth number from MPAC. It's a number we get from MPAC and we have no control over at the end of the day. We just want a number that we can use for preliminary planning purposes.
Councillor Kitcheris, following.
What was the past MPAC assessments? Like, what's the history of our, that's what part of my question was there.
Through Mayor Linton, sorry, Councillor Kitcheris, are you referring to the reassessment process in terms of when that actually happened?
No, we generally get rates of assessment at the budget time, and I mean, some have been up to 5.5 increase in assessments, and they're part of our budget process. So I wanted to know what the average was over a period of time in the past, and I just wanted to know the information.
Wasn't that your 2.4 over 10 years?
Yeah, that's the historical, the last 10 years, 2.4% average assessment growth. Yeah, I think that's the number you're looking for, Councillor Kitcheris.
Councillor Kitcheris?
If our assessment growth is 3, and we have a 1% more than you're using as your basis, does that money just add to our budget as cash flow, like extra cash?
Through Mayor Linton, yes. Whatever assessment growth ends up being from MPAC, that is the number we have to use in our budget process. We're going to use 2% as, we're planning on using 2% as the preliminary number. If it comes in at 3%, then we use 3% in the budget that Council receives in November. So the extra 1% is added to the budget.
Councillor Kitcheris, following.
Thank you, Mayor. So wouldn't that be a windfall for the municipality of extra cash?
Through Mayor Linton, it does provide additional funding in the budget, but based on Council's strategic direction of growth paying for growth, it would be allocated to growth-related impacts on the township.
And just to clarify, in November, if you hear that 3% is more accurate, you'll be using the 3% as the basis moving forward.
That is correct.
So this is just to do your initial work.
Yes, we get sporadic information from MPAC between now and November, but the final assessment growth number won't happen until November. So we need something to use for planning purposes between now and then.
Councillor McElwain?
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I just want to clarify, and it's just based upon the wording of the resolution, I think, as much as anything, Dan. It says, assume the growth equal to 2% to be used to fund budget increases considered to be growth in nature. That sounds like expense, whereas the 2% is also income. So, I mean, should it not be a saw-off? Why are we even considering it, I guess is the question. It's if we have a budget increase income of 2% and we have a budget cost of 2% based upon growth pays for growth, is this even a consideration for the budget?
Dan?
Yes, good question, Councillor McElwain. Through Mayor Lenton, the 2% assessment growth is considered funding, and through the strategic direction by council, it is to fund growth-related cost increases. So if we have programming or operating cost-related increases due to additional roads, water mains, wastewater mains, programming, fire services, et cetera, those are costs that would increase as a result of growth in 2022. And rather than have those cost increases borne by the taxpayer as in terms of a rate increase, we're proposing through the strategic direction passed by council that it's funded through this additional assessment growth that is coming in 2022. So yes, I see your point where it's netting to zero, where you want your growth related impacts from a cost perspective to equal your increase in assessment growth. But that's not always the case. In a lot of years, you get costs due to growth that exceed assessment growth, and staff are absorbing that within the operating budget.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Councillor McElwain,
Sorry,
there you go.
I guess somebody muted me there. As far as your costs, Dan, then as part of the budget process, I guess I go back to what I said before. I mean, it really, whether it's 2% or 10%, it doesn't really bother you one way or the other, because it's whatever increase we're getting based upon new assessment is being spent on the new costs associated with that assessment. It is not something that it affects taxation in any way.
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor McElwain. It's more of a items that net to zero within the budget process, and it doesn't impact the tax rate increase.
Thank you.
Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Thank you. Yeah, I like what's proposed here, the 2% assessment growth, and I understand the process of just looking at it. This is something that we're doing to give Dan and Mark and them a little bit of a basis as to we've agreed to start here instead of having an argument afterwards saying why did we start here. So I'd say start here, and if we see some drastic changes again as we near the end of the year, then we can always adjust, but this gives you a good direction.
Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Mayor. I think most of our problem has to do with management cost control, and here we are looking ahead trying to predict future revenue that may or may not occur from new assessment. And I'm not necessarily opposed to this motion, but it still remains that this revenue may occur or it may not occur, and I'm not sure how baking it into the projection for spending is going to help us. I get the part about growth paying for growth. Maybe you can help me understand, Dan, what is the net outcome? Let's say we did not do this. What would be the outcome? Can you help me understand that, Dan? This particular item in this particular motion.
Through Mayor Linton, the assessment growth becomes, I'm trying to think the best way to explain this. From a taxation rate perspective, the assessment growth gets added to the previous year's levy to form the base levy for the next year at a 0% increase. So we would take the 2021 budget and the tax levy associated with that, add assessment growth to it to give us the base budget for 2022 at 0% increase. So it's reflecting the impact from the previous year as a result of growth, and that becomes your starting point to set the 2022 budget. So it really is a foundational item that we need to pass or to start the 2022 budget.
Thank you, Dan. No further questions, Mayor.
Okay, I'm okay with this as a starting point assumption as well. Any additional questions from Councilor Kitchis?
Thank you, Mayor. So Dan, from what you just said, your revenues will increase if we pass 2.4 and we assume 2, your revenues will increase 4.4. Is that right?
Through Mayor Linton, the math is a little bit more complicated than that. You take last year's levy, add 2% growth, and that's your base levy, and then the 2.4% increase in taxation is on top of that. But in a sense, it's very similar to what you're referring to, just slightly different in terms of the calculation.
Councilor Kitchis? Councilor Kitchis, you're muted.
Thank you, Mayor. So Dan, then the resident will pay a 4.4% increase. Is that accurate?
Through Mayor Linton, no, that's not accurate. The resident will pay the 2.4%, and the 2% reflects additional assessment and taxation revenue coming in from new properties and expansions and so forth. So the net impact to the existing taxpayer would be the 2.4% approved by council in part 1 of this discussion.
Councilor Kitchis? Councilor Kitchis, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mayor. If our revenue, if the growth was actually larger, let's say 3.5, we would have these extra revenues from the growth. Then why are we increasing the taxes without knowing accurately what this assessment growth and agreeing to them? Because actually we would have the revenues extra. See, like you're making this one extremely low so that you get the extra revenues. And then at the tax rate, which we just voted on, you have it higher. So really they go hand in hand. And actually I know you need this for your budget point of view, but for the taxpayer, you have the revenues. And if it goes up higher, I think that this should be actually higher, because I don't understand why you're doing the 2.4, because it could be higher. We're saying that there will be growth. There will be large growth. There's whole subdivisions planned, South River, more of the Soberas and all sorts of places. And that's going to increase our revenues. And therefore, why are we actually adding more taxes to the whole process? That just seems like it seems at this time to bake it in until we know what the assessment rate is accurately. This seems to be wrong. And I think this should be actually as high as possible and see the last 5 years, not the 10 years, so we can see how the projection goes. And therefore it would be much more accurate. But now you've lowered this one so that then you have this extra cash and the taxpayer doesn't get a break.
So I'm going to turn over to Dan in a second, but I wanted to mention something. The whole reason that we determine an assumption for assessment growth is based on our policy that growth needs to pay for growth. So we have to make an assumption about what that growth is. Our managing director of corporate services and treasurer, Dan, has already indicated that this has to be accurate. He's not artificially making it high or artificially making it low. It has to be accurate based on the last 10 years. And he's laid out the assumptions behind 2% being accurate as a starting point, and then making sure it's more accurate when November hits. So I'm not sure why we're having this lengthy conversation about it, because it is important that we identify accurately what our growth rate is in order to make sure that growth continues to pay for growth. And so that's why Dan has laid out how he's established that as a target and made it really clear if that target is off in November, then we'll modify that target. So not sure where the challenge is there. This is how we do this year over year. And it's because of our policy that growth needs to pay for growth. Dan, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Linton. I agree with everything you're saying, Mayor Linton, in terms of the assessment growth increase and the tax rate increase are really two different perspectives of the budget, two different aspects of the budget. The assessment growth and the strategic objective of growth paying for growth is very important from a budget perspective. We have impacts of growth annually that far exceed assessment growth, especially on the capital side in terms of new assets and construction as a result of growth and the ongoing life cycle costs associated with that. So to the extent that growth instead of 2% becomes 3%, there's more than enough impacts of growth to accommodate that, where the tax rate increase is not looking at the impacts of growth, it's looking at the impacts of inflation, the impacts of providing levels of service to existing residents. So really, at the end of the day, they're both taxation revenue, but they're sources of funding, and the reason why we're receiving the funding are completely different.
Councillor McCray.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I just want to make a point. The last few times Councillor Foster has made references to management's poor fiscal management of our municipality. That hasn't been my experience. I think as a community, we're very fortunate to have the individuals we do looking over our finances and running this community. And I think going forward, if comments are made sort of impugning the reputation of staff, we should stand up and stop it, because quite frankly, I'm annoyed with this.
Point of order, Mayor. Point of order, please.
What's your point of order, Councillor Foster?
Councillor McCray, at no time did I use the phrase poor management. What I said was there is a need for management cost control. Every successful organization does that. At no time did I impugn any staff member.
The very implication of what you just said implies it, Councillor Foster.
Not at all, sir. Point of order.
Okay. Any other questions related to this item? Councillor Kitchus?
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
Sure. Councillor Dunsmore?
I would like to make the motion that we direct staff to use the 2% growth in order to get the budget process started.
Thanks, Councillor Dunsmore. A seconder for that motion? Councillor McCray? All in favor? Opposed? And that carries, and I'll allow our clerk to do the recorded vote.
Oops. Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Van Leeuwen,
Yes.
Councillor Dunsmore,
Yes.
Councillor McCray,
Yes.
Councillor McElwain,
Yes,
Councillor Kittredge, sorry, Councillor Kittredge, I didn't hear you.
No,
Councillor Foster
No,
and Mayor Linton,
Yes.
and it carries.
Okay, thanks, Council. Going on to section 3, fees and charges, and there's a proposed resolution to increase the fees and charges for 2022, and there's 3 options there: 3.2%, 2.4%, and 2%. Other than where pressure on rates indicates an alternate rate charge. So this is, we got some direction last time we removed the Parks and Rec fees, and we put those at 0. And again, I think our treasurer has laid out, somebody will be paying for these services, so it's up to council to decide whether the users pay the increase or whether the taxpayer pays the increase, because they will be paid for. Okay, so I'll open it up to questions from council. Councillor Foster?
no questions, Mayor. It's just, it's an ongoing issue. We have to do a better job controlling our operating costs so that we can control these fee increases, and I don't see that we're doing that. I call for a 0% increase in fees and charges for all the reasons already mentioned: difficult economy, transitory inflation, better cost control, and because our people are suffering, and high taxation and high increase in fees is not the goal this year. One of the most challenging years in the last 100 years. 0 is the better way.
Councillor Van Leeuwen?
I think that this is the year that we would continue with our regular schedule as shown.
So just to confirm, Councillor Van Leeuwen, there's 3 options there. Is there, and staff are looking for us to identify what that option is. Does that mean the same as our tax rate, the 2.4, or what do you think?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so basically, if we deferred it from public, from Parks and Recs last year, I think this year we need to get back on schedule, and let's use our regular tax rate.
Thanks for that clarification. Councillor McElwain?
thanks, Mayor. la-
Sorry, Councillor McElwain, you're muted somehow.
Okay, sorry. Last year, we increased these fees and charges by 0.33% more than the inflation rate, or more than the agreed to rate, because we put the fees and charges through before the lower NRBP CPI was calculated. And so therefore, I would suggest that we head for the 2% this year, but decrease it by the 0.33 that we overcharged last year to bring it back down to 1.67.
Okay, thanks, Councillor McElwain. Councillor Kittredge?
Thank you, Mayor. I think we shouldn't be really increasing these, and given the choice of these 3, I agree with Councillor McElwain about having it lower, because we just always are increasing it. And I would prefer that it actually be lower and reflect the fiscal facts of what happened and the realities.
Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that we tie it to the 2.4%. And if the fees are too high when we see the budget book come out, we can always look at it again in December and have a look at it. But for the budget purposes, I would tie it to 2.4 or less, the same as we're doing the increase.
Councillor McCray?
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I would tie it to the 2.4 to match the tax increase. Anything less would be putting more of a burden on the taxpayer.
Thanks, Council. I also think it should be tied to the tax rate increase. I think that makes a lot of sense. Any other questions from or comments from members of council? Councillor Kittredge? You're muted, Councillor Kittredge.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we should have it at a lower rate. And I think I put forward a motion of 1.7 as a good start for the fees. Those are direct costs that ordinary citizens have to pay. And I don't think that we should be increasing them. It's always better to start lower and then increase, because once you've built and we've had the staff work for so long, they resist because they've worked so hard to increase it. So like that's how you do budgeting, because you kind of are trying to be conservative. And I think that we should do that. I think so. I motion that we do it for 1.7 and leave it at there. So we've got a seconder.
Okay, so we have a motion for a fee increase of 1.7 on this one. Any seconder, Councillor McElwain? Any comments on that before we vote? Councillor Foster?
Well, thank you, Mayor. Hockey Canada is talking about how hockey is becoming more and more unaffordable for many Canadians. And here we are increasing the cost of ice time. That has a direct impact on the cost of hockey. I've also received two calls from constituents who could not afford to have their loved ones buried here because of our high costs of a burial plot. These fees and charges have a direct impact on people's lives. And it's very important, as I've already said, to control our operating costs so we can control tax rate increases and fee and charge increases. And I would like to propose, Councillor Kittredge, a friendly amendment that rather than 1.7, it would be 1.0. I could live with that. So I'm proposing that we amend it to 1% only.
Yeah, 1.7 to 1 is not friendly amendment. That's a whole other motion. So we'll go through the right process for that. Any other questions or any comments about the 1.7? Councillor Kittredge, you moved it, so I'm assuming you're in favor of it. Anybody else? Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Thanks. I just like, if these are the fees and charges that increase, if we don't increase the fees of the users, then the taxpayer as a whole or on general pay the difference. And I think that that's where my concern is although we want people to be able to use it, especially at this time, many people are using different types of entertainment, different types of sports, outside sports. But then we're making all taxpayers pay the hockey, the pool, all these things. So I think that the fees and charges should stay with inflation, and those who use it, it slowly starts to go up. And I realize that they have not necessarily gotten their as long a use this year. It's some of the effects of these lockdowns, but it does still cost us a lot of money. And this is what you see in whether you're running a business or whether you're running the township. You cannot just disperse of those assets, or I should say the costs of those assets. They're still there. And I think that's the effects of and the detrimental effects of these lockdowns, that we need to continue to pay for these assets.
Councillor McElwain?
I just want to reiterate that last year we overcharged by 0.33%. above the NRB CPI, which is what this is based on. So knocking that 0.33% off the increase this year isn't us losing anything. It's just us paying back to the community what we overcharged them last year.
Any final comments about this, Councillor Kittrus?
Thank you, Mayor. I have to agree with Councillor McElwain about that. I also know that in terms of budgeting process, Councillor Van Leeuwen, we can increase this later at any time. But to start at the higher rate is a mistake. It's better to go lower and then increase it as the data comes in. And that's, yes, you do have to cover those costs, but as a budgeting process, that's what we're being asked here right now. I think that we should have it as accurate as we can, taking into account what Councillor McElwain has said. And I think that we should vote to be as conservative as possible, because we can always increase it as we get more information, which will be probably 5 months later. So, up to. So there's many occasions and many meetings that we have that we can receive that information. So I'm just saying that I believe that this is the prudent and the most conservative way, and I would like a recorded vote.
Okay, yeah, we'll do a recorded vote. Any other comments about this? Okay, all those in favor of a 1.7% increase in fees and charges in 2022? Opposed? And that's defeated. I'll turn it over to our clerk, Carrie, for the recorded vote.
Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Van Leeuwen,
No.
Councillor Dunsmore,
No.
Councillor McRae,
Nope.
Councillor McElwain,
Yes.
Councillor Kittrus,
Yes?
Councillor Foster,
Yes.
Mayor Linton.
No.
It's defeated.
Okay, so we still need to provide some direction to staff on this one, as far as an increase for the fees and charges. Any other motion there, Councillor McRae?
I'd like to put forward the motion that we go with 2.4%.
Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Dunsmore? All in favor? Oh, sorry, I forgot to ask for comments. Councillor Van Leeuwen, comment?
Thanks for the comment. Can we have it, maybe this is a friendly amendment, but it was 2.4 following the tax rate. If we go with 2.4 or less on the tax rate, then we follow the inflationary tax rate, or sorry, the tax rate that we decide.
Yeah, I think that is friendly. It stays with the same number. You okay with that, Councillor McRae?
Yes.
And you're okay with that, Councillor Dunsmore? You seconded it, right? Yeah. Any other comments about that, Councillor Kittrus?
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
Does anybody have a problem with us doing a recorded vote for every section here? Okay, that'll just streamline the process. So recorded vote for every vote that we do from now on. Councillor McElwain?
Once again, we overcharged by 0.33% last year. So if we are going to increase our base to 2.4%, I suggest that it should be 2.4% minus 0.33% that we overcharged last year.
Councillor Foster?
I'm not in favor of 2.4, as I've already stated. We're rapidly heading towards empty hockey rinks and unaffordable fees and charges, and folks can't afford burial plots among many other of our services. You're going to skate into non-compliance on things like dog tags, fire permits, if you continue to just raise these fees and charges. This has been a very difficult year for everyone. We have people on CERB. As I've already stated, I can't support this. This was the year to show leadership on cost control. And when you show leadership on cost control, you can show leadership on maintaining your fees and charges where they are. So I'm opposed.
Okay, I'll call the vote. All in favor of the 2.4 or less, tying it back to tax rate? Opposed? And that's carried, and I'll turn it over to our clerk to do the recorded vote.
Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Van Leeuwen,
In favor.
Councillor Dunsmore,
Yes.
Councillor McCray,
Yes.
Councillor McElwain,
No,
Councillor Kittredge,
No.
Councillor Foster,
Absolutely no.
and Mayor Linton.
Yes.
Thank you. It is carried.
Okay, moving on to our fourth section, and that's OMPF funding. Again, that's just historic. We're just asking, and really no proposed resolution on this. Is there any kind of direction that you need from this, Dan, or is this just a separate item for council's information, I think?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Linton. This was just for council's information. We don't need any direction in this area.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Moving on to section 5, OCIF funding. Again, it is what it is. No resolution required from council on this. Is that correct, Dan?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Councillor Foster, you have a question?
Thank you, Mayor. Question for our treasurer, Dan. If no decision or resolution is required, why has this information been tabled? It appears to be justification for a tax rate increase.
I think I can answer that one, Dan. This is a pre-budget meeting, and for pre-budget meetings, the staff provide council with all the information that staff feels like we need in order to understand the assumptions that they're building their budget on top of. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Dan?
Just one point, Mayor Linton, thank you. We're just providing overall information on provincial federal funding coming in that affect the budget. We didn't just focus on the fees that are staying the same or being reduced. We did mention that we got a significant increase in gas tax funding, and that's reflected in one of the recommendations. So we're just providing information to council that's required to make the decisions today.
Councillor Foster, are you just going to repeat the last thing you said, or are you going to say something new?
Thank you, Mayor Linton. My question is for Dan. I'd like to understand if we're about $1.2 million in OMP funding, can you help me understand, Dan, why that is such an important issue when we've doubled our tax intake since the year when OMP was $1.5 million? We've lost $1.2 million, $1.3 million in OMP funding, yet we've gone from 7 to 15 million in tax. Why is that loss of OMP funding an issue? Why is that a material amount?
Dan, do you have an answer for that? It's you're providing information on changes to provincial funds coming in both cases. Is there anything
Point of order,
you
Mayor.
want to add to that?
Mayor, point of order.
What's your point of order, Councillor Foster?
Mayor, I've asked a legitimate business question of our treasurer, and I don't think you should be telling him what his answer ought to be. I'd like to hear from our treasurer. That's a legitimate question. I'd like a straight answer, please.
Thanks for the question. I'm ruling your point of order. I'm ruling against your point of order. I'm chairing the meeting, and he already responded once to this exactly the same question, and I'm asking him right now if he has anything in addition to me repeating what answer he already provided for all of council's benefit, and I'm asking Dan to respond if he has anything else to add. Dan, do you have anything else to add?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Linton. Just one additional point. I think in the light of some of the asset management conversations we've had today, and the significant need to increase our asset investment. I think this reflects that if OMPF funding did not decrease from 2009 to today, that would be an additional 1.3 million in our budget that could go towards something like capital investment. So all else being equal, it's funding we've lost over that period of time.
And I think it suits all council to have a good context when they go into any budget session. Moving on to, Councillor Kittrus.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a question about the general capital reserve balances and the use of that. Can you explain, there's a calculation here of existing balance, and why do you minus the minimum balance, since that is actually in the reserve? I'm just wondering why you do that and you don't spend, like it's not part of the calculation when it's obviously it's still there and we're not shortfalled at all. We have actually about 100% more than the minimum, but we're asking to increase the budget contribution. So I'm just wondering why that is.
Dan?
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mayor Linton. This is actually part of Section 7, but I can address this now. So the 1.1 million minimum balance is reflected in that we want to keep 1.1 million in the general capital reserve and not use it as part of the budget process, so that that funding is there just in case tenders go over budget or another budget need that is unplanned for comes up during the year. Then the 1.1 million remains in the general capital reserve and can be used through council direction. So it is being deducted from what is available to use for budget purposes because we want to keep that funding in the general capital reserve.
Councillor Kittrus. Councillor Kittrus, you're muted.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we should, it's not accurate though, because we actually have, with the 875, we actually have in the reserve, not 2.2, the 2,000,026, we actually have 3.126 in the reserve. So shouldn't it just reflect the actual amount?
Through you, Mayor Linton, the amount that we're proposing to put into the 2022 budget, which is $2,051,000, is equal to the existing balance, less the minimum balance, less the amount that was borrowed from this reserve, and then add in $900,000. So it's basically saying, other than the amount we've already paid, or sorry, the amount we've already spent in terms of the loan amount of $260,000, and the amount we want to keep in the reserve of 1.1 million, we're saying the rest of that reserve is available for the budget process. So I think we're saying the same thing. We're looking at it in a different perspective.
Okay, so I'm going to get our fourth resolution on the table, and that's include approximately 1.7 million in growth-related capital projects to be funded by development charges within each year of the draft 10-year capital forecast. Can I get a mover for that, please? Councillor McCray, second by Councillor Dunsmore. Any questions on that resolution? 1.7 million in growth-related capital projects. Councillor Kittrus? Councillor Kittrus, you're muted.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't understand why we're increasing by $25,000 the amount in the reserve when we have such a large surplus over the minimum. Again, it's another taxation on individuals at a time when they don't have those extra cash. And so I don't understand why we're doing this at this time. And so I don't think I can agree with this, because I don't think that we should be adding the $25,000. I think we should just leave it at what we have, like, and then it wouldn't be even an issue on this. So,
Anything else to add on that, Dan?
Yes, we've been adding $25,000 per year to that reserve fund contribution for a number of years now. That would be included in the 2.4% or less increase in taxation that is included in the first resolution that was provided today. It's not in addition to. So we're just saying that it's very good practice to increase our investment in assets. We want to continue to do that annually, and it would be part of what's already been reflected in previous resolutions.
Okay, so we have a mover or seconder for this. So in the interest of time, I'll just turn it over to a clerk to do the vote. Carrie?
Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Van Leeuwen,
Yes.
Councillor Dunsmore,
Yes.
Councillor McCray,
Yes.
Councillor McElwain,
Yes.
Councillor Foster,
No,
Councillor Kittredge,
yes.
and Mayor Linton.
Yes.
It's carried.
Okay, so moving on to our next recommendation there is allocate the following funding to the draft capital budget. $4,547,988 in combined general capital reserve, federal tax, and OLG funds. An increase in funding of $79,000 to the tax-supported equipment and vehicle replacement reserves, and allocations to the WSIB reserve, insurance claims reserve, contingency reserve, and legal matters reserve as per the township funding targets and the reserve policy. Can I have a mover for that recommendation, please? Councillor Dunsmore, seconded by Councillor McCray. Any discussion on this item?
Sorry, Carrie, can you Carrie? Turn your,
Sorry?
just turn your,
Oh, my mute.
Councillor Kittredge?
Thank you, Mayor. Since we're talking about tax-supported equipment and vehicle replacement reserves, and to fund the equipment and vehicle part of the budget, I was wondering when we were going to see our procurement policy come forward from the strategic plan. We've had 3 budgets now. This will be our last one, basically, for our term. We had a strategic plan to do this procurement for all those vehicle and equipment replacements. And I don't know, is that something for the tracking list, or is that like, what's that? Where can I ask this question, like, normally? Like, I mean, I'm just wondering, because I don't understand some of the procurement policies that we have, and I just thought we were going to reserve them, and we could see, like, for consultants, for all sorts of, which are part of the budget. So I just kind of wondered where that is going.
Okay, so the question is the procurement purchasing bylaw. What's the timelines for it? Dan?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Linton. We've made significant progress in the review and update of our procurement bylaw. Given the legislative requirement to update our asset management plan, we've had to put the purchasing bylaw on the back burner for now because we're legislatively required to have an update to our asset management plan. And we've had to dedicate our resources to that initiative in the short term rather than procurement. I'm hoping to get the purchasing bylaw in front of council, if not later this year, then very early in 2022. We just need to see how long it takes to get through the asset management update and present that to council.
Okay, thanks for that, Dan. Councillor Kittredge?
Just to follow up on that, will that be going on the tracking list? Because I think it's what was a strategic plan that we had decided on. And we will, if it comes after this budget process, basically, we will have not done anything on it after our budgets, which seems like that's partly why I think it was put on the strategic plan. So is that going to go on the tracking list?
Andy?
Thank you through your, Mr. Mayor. No, it's not on the tracking list. It is in the strategic plan. And as we report on the updates of the strategic plan, there are a number of initiatives that have been delayed or deferred till later due to the last 18 months being in COVID. A number of things have taken a lot of staff resources to be able to look after. And as Dan said, the asset management plan is a policy issue from provincial regulations that we have to meet. So that has taken priority over getting the purchasing policy in place before council.
Okay, so we have a mover and a seconder for this, and I'll turn it over to our clerk to do the official vote.
Through you, Mayor Linton, Councillor Van Leeuwen,
In favor.
Councillor Dunsmore,
Yes.
Councillor McCrae,
Yes.
Councillor McElwain,
Yes.
Councillor Foster,
No,
Councillor Kittredge,
I abstain.
that's a no, and Mayor Linton,
Yes.
that's carried.
Okay, moving
on to our last.
Okay. And our last item that we have is approving the proposed 2022 budget schedule. So I have a recommendation that the council approve the proposed 2022 budget schedule. Can I have a mover for that, please? Councillor McCrae, seconded by Councillor Kittredge. Any discussion about the schedule? Okay. Are we okay to do this without a recorded vote, or we do want a recorded vote on this? Should I record, should we do a recorded vote whether we want a recorded vote? All in favor?
Mayor, I suggest it's not required.
Okay, so just to be clear, the recommendation is that council approve the proposed 2022 budget schedule. All in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Kittredge, second by Councillor Dunsmore, all in favor. And we are adjourned until 1 o'clock, and we'll see you all back here. Thanks.